And when I mentioned a few moments ago the idea of diversity and how the newsroom has changed, I know that most journalism schools now in the country, I think it's the case here as well, have more women than men. By the way, I'm all for men. This is not about saying that we're not for you guys by any means. What does that mean? We've got more women that want to be journalists than men. Okay, that seems to be a trend around the country. Does that equate to sports departments? Certainly not yet. I'd say your average sports department, the numbers around the country for sports sections, newspapers, internet websites, whatever, basically 90% male, 10% female. So it's 50-50. I don't think will happen in your lifetimes. It may never happen, and that's okay. But obviously we want to have opportunities for young men and young women to have these jobs. But when you have women in the conversation in a sports department, you're going to have a little bit different coverage of things. When you have people of color in the newsroom, you're going to have a different conversation. It might not be that I, as a woman, am going to go and cover something or praise it, but I might just mention to a sports editor, we should actually cover that. I'll give you a perfect example of how diversity in the newsroom, some of you are in communications and journalism, how it can work. Back in the 1990s, there was, of course, the U.S. Open Golf, the men's U.S. Open, and there's the women's U.S. Open Golf. The golf writer for the Washington Post, where I was working, a man, wonderful guy, dear friend of mine to this day, he went and covered the U.S. Open, which is not called the men's Open because theoretically women could play in it, but it's all men. He covered that. Women's U.S. Open's coming a few weeks later. It's in Detroit, and it's not on the schedule for anyone to cover it. So I just happened to go in. I play golf, but it just dawned on me, if we're covering the men's, why aren't we covering the women's? And I said that to my sports editor. And he goes, you're right. We should be. You go and cover it. I wasn't a golf writer, but I did go. I did fly to Detroit, and I covered it. Point being, as a woman, it dawned on me that we weren't covering the women's. Not saying that every woman would think that way, and not saying that a man wouldn't think that way. But in this case, a very open-minded, wonderful sports editor, still one of my great mentors and bosses in my life and influences my life, didn't think of it. Kind of hard to believe, but he didn't. So I mentioned it, which is my job as a member of the staff of the Washington Post, just to bounce ideas off people, and he pounced on it, and I went to cover it. If a woman's not in this sports department, maybe that thought doesn't happen, and maybe that event is not covered. That's why we want diversity. We want diversity, I think, everywhere in the workplace. But certainly, as a member of the media, thinking about it in terms of the media, that's a perfect example. Here's another one. We're at the Athens Olympic Games. I've been fortunate enough to cover 15 Olympics in a row, winter and summer, from LA in '84 through London, gearing up for Sochi in just 3.5 months, hard to believe. Athens Olympics 2004, I'm working for ESPN, among others, and we're doing an ESPN2 kind of roundup where we sit around and talk about the day's events in Athens. Michael Phelps, that was his first big Olympics, and there's a lot of stories, of course, gymnastics, what have you, that are going on. So ESPN, Bristol, our producer happens to be a woman on site in Athens, and she's getting the call from one of her people in Bristol at ESPN headquarters saying, why don't you talk about the hot U.S. Olympians, the hot U.S. Olympians? It's me and like 4 guys. Woody Page is one of them, if you watch some of the shows, and a few others. And so she says this to us, and we all are really good friends, and I'm the only woman, obviously, other than her there. And let's talk about the hot Olympians. And I said, hot as in good looking, or hot as in doing really well at the Athens Olympics? Of course, knowing the answer. And she goes, I think they mean hot as in good looking. And I said, I think he was on hold. The producer in Bristol, I think, was on the cell phone on hold or something. I said, you tell him that if it's hot as in performing well in the Olympics, we'll do it. If not, we're not touching it. She was in her 20s. I don't know that she'd ever heard anything quite like that. And at this point, I'm in my 40s, and I'm like, are you kidding? We're not doing this. Or I said, if the other option is we're going to talk about both good-looking women and good-looking men. And equal opportunity hotness, right? And so, because, ESPN does have female viewers, right? So obviously, what my choice was on this. She says that back to the producer. I hear silence for a couple seconds, and then she said, never mind, we're not doing that topic. Okay, at this point, I'm a veteran. I don't really care what people think about me. If you're 22, it's a little harder to say those words than if you're 45 or whatever I was back then. But my point is diversity. I'm there. I'm able to say no. If it's all guys, they play, yeah, let's do the hot Olympians. Oh, it's sexist. It's wrong. It's immaterial. We're talking sports. We're not talking about what people look like. I mean, how many ways can I say how terrible that was? So, but it's simple for me as someone who's just thinking a little bit differently than the guys. And all the guys completely went along and agreed. Woody Page, who doesn't, if you watch him on TV, he's a dear friend. He doesn't agree with a lot of stuff. He goes, yeah, you're right. We're not doing that. And off we went on a different topic, which was better for that, 30 seconds of television. And that's really all it was. So there's a little bit of the inside baseball view, if you will, of what having diversity means and actually in the decisions that are made than the things you read or the things you watch. And I encourage all of you, when you start your careers, if you're a student here, when you do start your careers, to open your mouth and to say those things. And you can be a man saying something about women or about a racial or religious issue, or vice versa. It doesn't have to be just because you're the woman you speak out about women's issues. But you keep an open mind, because the whole notion here is we're trying to attract new readers and new viewers. And by definition in sports, new readers, new viewers, new listeners are female. We got the guys. We're trying to get women. What good does it do us? This is not my calculation at this moment in Athens in '04, but what good does it do us to talk about hot women, good-looking women, which we didn't do, to attract the 12-year-old girl who we want to get to start watching TV, watching sports with her dad, right? So we shouldn't play to the frat house. We should think about that 10, 12-year-old girl as well as the 10, 12-year-old boy watching and act accordingly. And that's just kind of what I think, but hopefully that's something that will rub off, because more and more we will have women and girls watching and playing sports with Title IX, and we want to capture them, and when they're 25 and 30 and 40 and consumers buying cars and buying homes and needing mortgages, we want them to be watching those networks and reading those news sites that advertise. We want them just as much as we want the boy and the young man who's going to also be doing that. Just a few thoughts on a couple issues, and again, then we'll open it up for questions on some of the issues that I mentioned earlier. Diversity in sports, and why I do think that sports can help lead us. In some ways, sports can lag behind. There's no doubt about that. I mean, certainly if you look at the issue of gay rights, what's happening in the country, whatever, we're not going to talk about what we think about it in terms of whether you're for or against. That's not a topic for this lecture. But in terms of just looking at the view of the world and seeing where we are, we know that that's an issue that's growing in our country and seems to be growing in the affirmative that for gay marriage and what have you. But sports has been in some ways behind, obviously that last bastion of machoism. And then this spring there was Jason Collins, and I'm sure you're well aware of the story. And I would say that even though sports has been behind, to have a moment like that, whatever you may think of it, it is one of those seminal moments where you say, okay, we will now mark time, we will remember this man's name, and moving forward, it will be easier for the next man or whomever, dozens of guys, to do this if they so choose. I think that's what it is. It's a watershed moment. You can be pro or against. You can still acknowledge the historic impact of it. And then there was a soccer player, Robbie Rogers, that came out right after that. And actually he's played, whereas Jason Collins has not since then. But it makes it maybe a little bit easier and for the next person. And again, as a journalist looking at a historic moment, there's no doubt that is one. Now, a question that is often asked is, why isn't the same true for women? And I think we can safely say that a lot of these sports are seen as macho sports, so the guy who happens to be gay, that could be tougher for him to speak out about it. Locker room culture. Any of you played sports, you young men here, high football, you know what that culture's like, and that could just be more difficult. Let's hope in 10 years it will be far less difficult for any person with anything that they want to talk about. But for women, traditionally there have been more women, obviously, maybe again, these macho sports. Whatever the case may be, I'm not a sociologist or a psychologist, and this is not my area of expertise. But when women have come out, think about what's happened. Sheryl Swoopes, for example, the great basketball player. It was a big deal for like 12 minutes. And then everyone went on, and this was several years ago. Abby Wambach, the great soccer star. I'm sure many of you have cheered for her as she's won Olympic gold medals and done great at World Cups, even though the U.S. hasn't won. I mean, she's just a hero to millions of soccer-playing girls, including my 10-year-old niece in McLean, Virginia. Abby just recently married her partner. On and on it goes with female athletes who have seen it it's much easier, and it's each woman talks about this. I think increasingly it becomes less interesting to the media, which is probably exactly what we want. And so in 10, 20 years, will the Jason Collins of that time, oh, ho-hum, on to the next thing. I think we're probably headed in that direction, but there's always got to be a first. And Jason Collins this year was that. Diversity in sports, in this case, gay rights, certainly an issue. And I was very pleased to be able to report on it and talk about it, because these kind of societal issues are a big deal. And I do think that sports does, in that mirror that I talked about, does reflect those issues.